The afternoon sun of July 1971 hung heavily over the golden coast of Southern California, baking the Pacific air into a thick, shimmering haze. Down at Venice Beach, the atmosphere was alive with a raw, pulsing energy that felt almost electric. This wasn't just a stretch of sand and crashing waves. It was the undisputed epicenter of American strength culture, a legendary playground where bodybuilders, powerlifters, and heavy-duty athletes came to test their limits, forge their bodies into living monuments, and prove their dominance against the elements. The air itself carried a distinct, heavy fragrance, a potent mix of salty ocean spray, sun-baked sweat, and the coconut oil that glossed over countless rippling torsos. Everywhere you turned, human anatomy was pushed to astonishing extremes. Massive arms pumped iron with relentless determination, thick legs drove through heavy squats like hydraulic pistons, and chests swelled with such exaggerated development that they looked straight out of ancient Greek mythology. This was the sacred ground where modern bodybuilding was born, where icons like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Dave Draper had carved out their reputations through sheer grit, endless hours under the barbell, and an unshakable belief that bigger always meant better. Amidst this roaring arena of colossal proportions, a quiet family stroll was taking place along the sun-drenched pathway. Walking casually past the famous outdoor platforms were Bruce Lee, his wife Linda, and their two young children. Bruce looked entirely out of place in the best possible way. He wore simple, loose cotton trousers, a fitted t-shirt that hugged his lean frame, and comfortable sandals. There were no dark sunglasses to shield his face, no entourage of bodyguards clearing a path, and not a single outward sign that he was one of the most intensely focused martial artists and rising cinematic stars on the planet. This was a rare, precious day off, away from the grueling, high-pressure sound stages of Enter the Dragon. No intricate fight choreography to design, no demanding directors shouting orders, and no studio executives breathing down his neck. Just the warmth of the California sun, the sound of the ocean breaking against the shore, and the simple joy of being a husband and father. Young Brandon was darting ahead along the path, laughing and chasing after a flock of curious seagulls, while little Shannon rested safely and soundly in Linda's arms, looking at the vibrant world around her with that pure, untamed wonder only toddlers possess. Bruce walked with a soft, relaxed smile, completely at ease in his own skin, soaking in the sights and sounds of the bustling boardwalk. As they drew parallel to the main training area of Muscle Beach, Bruce's sharp eyes naturally drifted toward the heavy lifting platforms. He was a lifelong student of physical movement, endlessly fascinated by how different disciplines approach the human body. He watched with quiet curiosity as a burly bodybuilder bench pressed a staggering amount of weight, and a few feet away, a massive strongman hoisted a heavy dumbbell overhead with effortless authority. To Bruce, every form of physical expression was a study in physics, balance, and human potential. He didn't judge, he simply observed, always learning, always analyzing how power was generated and utilized. And then, cutting sharply through the ambient noise of the crashing waves and the clanging of iron, a voice boomed out. It was loud, abrasive, and dripping with that specific, unearned arrogance that only comes from a man who has spent his entire life surrounded by smaller people and has never truly faced a humbling physical challenge. "Now that's what a real man looks like," the voice roared, laughing loudly as he flexed for the small crowd of onlookers gathered around his platform. At first, Bruce didn't even flinch. The comment wasn't explicitly thrown his way. It was just another loudmouth holding court at Muscle Beach, playing to the gallery and showing off for the tourists. But the voice didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, sharper, and unmistakably aimed in Bruce's direction. Not like these little guys walking around thinking they're tough just because they know some fancy little karate chops. Size is everything. Real men have mass. Bruce stopped dead in his tracks. Linda noticed the sudden shift instantly. Her hand reached out instinctively, resting gently on Bruce's arm in a silent, questioning gesture. She knew that look. It was a subtle tightening around the eyes, not of anger, but of deliberate focus. Bruce offered a slight, reassuring shake of his head, communicating without words that it was nothing, that it didn't matter. But as he turned his head to look toward the source of the noise, the sheer scale of the man commanding the attention of the crowd became impossible to ignore. The individual standing at the center of the platform wasn't just big, he was terrifyingly massive. The individual standing at the center of the platform wasn't just big, he was terrifyingly massive. There is a profound difference between a bodybuilder and a strongman, and this man embodied that difference to its absolute extreme. Bodybuilders sculpted their frames for symmetry, aesthetics, and visual definition under stadium lights. Strongmen built their bodies for one brutal purpose: raw, overwhelming, immovable power. This man stood easily over 6 feet 3 inches tall, and as Bruce would soon discover, tipped the scales at a staggering 315 pounds. This wasn't soft bulk or lazy weight. It was dense, functional, colossal muscle. His forearms were thicker than most ordinary men's thighs. His chest resembled a solid brick wall, and his neck was so impossibly thick that his head seemed to sit directly upon his shoulders, without the intermediate space of a normal neck. Bare-chested and glistening heavily with sweat under the burning midday sun, he stood proudly beside a barbell loaded down with iron plates that easily crossed the 500-pound mark. He was in the middle of a heavy deadlift demonstration, soaking in the adulation of 20 or 30 spectators who had formed a tight circle around the wooden platform. His name was Kurt Wagner. While not yet a household name across America, he was a recognized monster within regional strength circuits. A man who held state powerlifting records and could squat and deadlift numbers that sounded like science fiction to the average person. Right now, he was staring directly at Bruce Lee, wearing a smug, condescending smirk that telegraphed his entire worldview. If you aren't big, you simply do not matter. Bruce stood his ground, holding Brandon's small hand, calmly taking in the spectacle of this massive human being, making a public display of himself. Linda leaned in close, her voice tight with quiet tension. "Bruce, let's just keep walking. He's either drunk, showing off, or probably both. It's not worth your time." Before Bruce could offer a reply, Kurt Wagner dropped the heavy barbell. The iron crashed against the wooden planks with a thunderous roar that vibrated through the ground, instantly silencing the surrounding chatter. With heavy, deliberate, and theatrical steps, Kurt began marching off the platform and straight toward them. The crowd instinctively parted before him like water. When you weigh over 300 pounds and possess the kind of brute strength that can bend steel, people naturally give you space. Kurt stopped just 10 feet away from Bruce. Up close, the physical disparity was almost comically stark. A surreal David and Goliath painting coming to life right on the sunlit sands of Venice Beach. Kurt's thick forearm was literally wider than Bruce's entire upper torso. One of his massive thighs weighed more than Bruce's entire body weight combined. "You hear me, little man?" Kurt barked, his voice carrying an aggressive edge that he tried to disguise as friendly banter for the crowd's amusement. "I said, real men have mass. Real strength comes from sheer size. All that kung fu dancing you little guys do on screens and in studios? That's not fighting. That's just theater for children." The crowd shifted instantly, sensing the delicious scent of confrontation. The bodybuilding demos were forgotten. All eyes were now locked onto the sudden clash between the towering mountain of muscle and the quiet, unassuming stranger. Bruce looked up at Kurt. His facial expression remained completely unreadable. No sudden flush of anger, no flicker of insecurity, no flash of wounded ego. Just a deep, calculating calm. He was reading this man the way an experienced detective reads a crime scene, looking straight past the loud words and the intimidating bulk to find the deep-seated psychological insecurity driving the performance. "You are a very strong man," Bruce said quietly. His voice wasn't defensive, nor was it sarcastic. It was a simple, objective statement of fact. Kurt threw his head back and let out a booming, triumphant laugh that echoed across the boardwalk. "Damn right I am. 315 pounds of pure, unstoppable power. I can deadlift twice my body weight without breaking a sweat. Can you say the same, little man?" "No, I cannot," Bruce replied evenly, his tone completely level. That simple, unfiltered honesty completely threw Kurt off balance. He had been fully prepared for a defensive outburst, an ego-driven challenge, or some petty excuse. Instead, he got calm, total agreement. It stalled his rhythm, leaving him blinking in sudden confusion for a split second, before he quickly scrambled to regain his footing in front of his audience. "So you admit it then?" Kurt pressed harder, stepping closer, desperately trying to reclaim the psychological high ground. "Size matters. Strength is all that matters. A guy your size, what are you? Maybe 140 pounds soaking wet?" 135, Bruce corrected him softly, offering the exact number with a faint, knowing smile that only served to deepen the growing tension in the air. 135 pounds, Kurt shouted back, turning his massive frame toward the watching crowd like a stand-up comedian delivering a punchline. A wave of low chuckles rippled through the onlookers. "Did you all hear that? 135 pounds. Look at him, folks, is that muscle? That ain't muscle, that's just lean air. Real men have mass. You can't fight gravity, you can't fight physics, and you certainly can't fight 315 pounds of solid, hard-earned iron with toothpicks for arms." The crowd loved it. To them, the logic was ironclad, simple, and undeniable. In the raw, unfiltered world of 1970s strength culture, size was the ultimate currency. If you were big, you commanded respect. If you were small, you stayed out of the way. Kurt stood there bathing in the approval, chest puffed out, shoulders squared, looking down at Bruce with an expression that mixed absolute amusement with total condescension. He truly believed he had won the argument without even throwing a punch, simply by existing as a human wall. Yet, underneath the surface noise of the boardwalk, something strange was happening. History has a funny way of burying profound truths under layers of conventional wisdom. For generations, the world had been fed the comfortable myth that bigger is always better, that power is solely a byproduct of physical volume. But the people who stood shoulder to shoulder on that Venice Beach afternoon and witnessed what happened next could never look at strength the same way again. They realized that beneath the loud bravado of the strongman culture lay a massive blind spot, one that was about to be exposed in the most dramatic way imaginable. Bruce did not blink. He did not tighten his jaw, nor did he shift his weight defensively. Instead, a very faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth. It wasn't a mocking grin or a challenging sneer. It was the quiet, knowing smile of a master who had heard this exact argument 1,000 times before, from 1,000 different men who confused volume with capability. He looked at Kurt the way an engineer looks at a badly designed engine, loud, heavy, and full of moving parts, but ultimately inefficient. "You want to test your theory?" Bruce asked, his voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the beach without needing to raise a single decibel. At those words, Kurt's eyes lit up. This was the exact escalation he had been fishing for. The crowd, sensing an actual confrontation brewing, pressed in closer, forming a tighter circle around the wooden platform. A few local faces in the crowd, guys who recognized Bruce from his television appearances on the Green Hornet, or from local martial arts circles where he taught private lessons, suddenly went quiet. They knew who he was. They knew what discipline lived behind those calm eyes. But to the casual onlookers and the heavy-lifting regulars, it still looked like a tragic mismatch. A featherweight walking willingly into the lion's den. Kurt puffed himself up even more, playing entirely to the roaring gallery. "Test it? How do you want to test it, little man? You want a wrestling match? Do you want to try to pick me up? Because I warn you, I'm a professional. I know my own strength, and I don't want to accidentally put you in the hospital." "I appreciate your concern," Bruce replied smoothly, his tone entirely devoid of sarcasm or ego. He wasn't playing the game Kurt thought they were playing. "Truly, I do. But I need you to understand something. If we do this, you need to actually try. Do not pull your techniques. Do not hold back because you think you might hurt me, and don't try to go easy out of politeness. Use your full strength, your full speed, and your full weight. Otherwise, this demonstration won't prove anything at all." Kurt blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Nobody talked to him like that. People either avoided him or treated him with cautious kid gloves. "You're sure about that?" he asked, a tiny flicker of genuine uncertainty suddenly creeping into his voice. There was something deeply unsettling about Bruce's absolute, unwavering tranquility. It didn't look like bravery. It looked like absolute certainty. 6 seconds, Bruce said softly, raising his hand slightly with his fingers extended. Give me 6 seconds of your absolute best. Full power, no holding back. After 6 seconds, we will both know everything we need to know." Kurt let out another laugh, but this time it lacked its previous booming resonance. It sounded slightly forced, a defense mechanism against a creeping unease he couldn't quite place. 6 seconds? Man, I could put you through that wooden platform in 3 seconds flat. You wouldn't even know what hit you.
"Then do it," Bruce answered simply.
Behind them, Linda had gently guided young Brandon and baby Shannon several steps back from the platform. She didn't panic, she didn't yell, and she didn't try to intervene. She knew that exact look on Bruce's face. She had seen it in private dojos, behind closed doors, and during intense training sessions. Bruce wasn't angry. He wasn't fighting out of malice or wounded pride. He had shifted entirely into teacher mode. He had spotted a profound ignorance, a fundamental misunderstanding of human mechanics, and he had quietly decided that a lesson needed to be taught. And when Bruce Lee decided to teach a lesson, the entire universe seemed to stop and pay attention. The crowd around the platform had swelled now, drawing nearly 50 onlookers. Across the sand, other bodybuilders and weightlifters dropped their dumbbells, paused their sets, and turned their full attention toward the wooden stage. Word was rippling down the shoreline like wildfire. Something big was about to go down at Muscle Beach. Kurt stepped fully onto the wooden training platform, his massive bare feet gripping the planks. He rolled his heavy shoulders, feeling the familiar, comforting surge of adrenaline. Dominating physical challenges was what he did best. It was the language he had spoken his entire adult life through wrestling matches, street brawls, and heavy lifting competitions. Bruce followed him onto the platform. If those fingers locked onto Bruce's shoulders, the sheer disparity in size would end the confrontation in a fraction of a second. Once again, Bruce wasn't there. Instead of retreating, Bruce did something that completely defied every instinctual reaction of a smaller fighter. He stepped inside Kurt's reach. He slipped directly into the blind spot beneath the giant's swinging arms, pressing so close to Kurt's massive frame that the bigger man's long, heavy limbs suddenly became useless leverage points. You cannot throw a devastating punch or apply a crushing hold when your opponent is standing inside your optimal striking arc. Panic flickered in Kurt's eyes. Frustrated and disoriented, he abandoned the grab and threw a punch, not a technical, measured boxing jab, but a massive, looping overhand right, powered by the full rotational torque of 315 pounds of bulk. If that blow connected with even a fraction of its intended force, it possessed enough kinetic energy to knock out a professional heavyweight. It was a punch built to shatter bones and end street fights permanently. Bruce's hand came up. It didn't rise to block with brute force, nor did it tense up to absorb the impact. His fingers merely brushed against Kurt's hurtling wrist with a light, almost delicate precision. And then, something happened that defied every single law of combat that the gathered spectators thought they understood. The massive, high-velocity punch, traveling with hundreds of pounds of destructive force, simply stopped dead in midair. It didn't bounce off a guard. It didn't push Bruce back an inch. The energy of the strike completely vanished, deflecting away into nothingness as if it had struck an invisible, impenetrable steel wall. Kurt's face contorted in sheer, unadulterated bewilderment. How was it possible that a 135-pound man had completely neutralized a heavyweight's haymaker using nothing more than a fingertip touch? 3 seconds had elapsed, and this was the precise moment Bruce struck. It wasn't a wild combination of flurry punches. It wasn't a flashy cinematic kick designed to impress the gallery. It was a single, solitary strike, delivered with that exact, devastating mechanical precision that Bruce had spent his entire life perfecting. Bruce's right fist fired outward from his side in what looked like zero time. 1 microsecond, his hand was relaxed at his hip. The next microsecond, his knuckles were buried deep into the exact center of Kurt's massive, heavily armored torso, straight into the solar plexus. The sound that followed wasn't the dull thud of flesh hitting muscle. It was a sharp, piercing snap of displaced air, followed by a wet, heavy thud that echoed cleanly across the open beach. 50 people standing around the platform physically winced just from hearing the impact. Kurt Wagner, 315 pounds of walking muscle, a regional strongman powerhouse who regularly absorbed heavy blows that would hospitalize ordinary men, stopped moving entirely. Every single muscle in his body locked up, as if struck by a lightning bolt. His eyes blew wide open, bulging against his eyelids in sudden, terrifying shock. His mouth dropped open, gasping frantically for air, but his lungs refused to cooperate. His massive arms, which a fraction of a second earlier had been reaching out with terrifying, crushing intent, instantly went completely limp. They dropped heavily to his sides like the strings of a broken marionette. For a heartbeat, Kurt stood frozen on the spot, suspended between momentum and gravity. Then, he took one slow, heavy step backward, then another. Finally, his knees buckled. This towering mountain of a man, this undisputed king of raw mass and heavy iron, didn't fall or crash down like a felled tree. He simply sank straight down onto the wooden platform, sliding into a heap as if his legs had completely forgotten how to interpret weight, gravity, or balance. 4 seconds had passed. The entire crowd went dead silent. Not a whisper, not a murmur, not even the sound of shuffling feet broke the heavy stillness over the boardwalk. 50 people stood frozen in absolute collective shock. They had all watched it happen with their own eyes. They had seen the size difference, they had heard the boasts, and they had witnessed the charge. Yet their brains were utterly incapable of reconciling the basic physics of what had just occurred right in front of them. Bruce stood exactly where he had been standing a moment before. He wasn't breathing heavily. His chest barely moved. His hand returned smoothly to his side, his posture relaxed and completely unbothered. He looked down at the massive man collapsed at his feet with zero arrogance, zero gloating, and zero triumph. There was only quiet, profound patience, waiting for the reality of the lesson to finally sink through the shock. The bell for the end of the round rang, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the rafters. Saskia retreated to her corner, her chest heaving, her coach hovering over her, yelling instructions in Dutch that sounded like background noise. She couldn't hear him. All she could hear was the rhythm of her own heart and the lingering echo of Bruce's movements. She sat on the stool, feeling the cold air hit her skin, and looked across the ring. Bruce wasn't sitting. He was leaning against the ropes, relaxed, his eyes drifting over the crowd. He looked like he was enjoying himself. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Because she realized then that she was fighting a man who wasn't worried about losing. He was just waiting for her to understand the lesson he was trying to teach. The bell rang for the second round, slicing through the tense air of the warehouse. It felt louder this time, sharper. Saskia stood up from her stool, her legs feeling heavy, not just from the weight she carried, but from the invisible tax Bruce Lee had been charging her every second they stood in that ring. Her coach, a grizzled man who had seen her win dozens of times, was shouting in her ear, his voice urgent, desperate. But she wasn't listening. She was staring across the ring at Bruce. He didn't look like a fighter. He looked like a man standing on a beach, watching the tide. Saskia knew what she had to do. She had been fighting since she was a teenager. She knew that when speed and precision outclass power, you don't fight fire with fire. You change the landscape. She needed to take away his space. She needed to make the ring smaller. She needed to use that 100-pound weight advantage, not to strike, but to smother. When the round started, she didn't rush. She moved with a controlled, predatory focus. She kept her chin tucked, her hands high, and she began to walk him down. She was trying to force him toward the ropes, to trap him in a corner where his fluid movement would be suffocated by her frame. It was a sound strategy. Against any other opponent it would have worked. But Bruce Lee was not like anyone she had ever stepped in the ring with. As she closed the distance, trying to corner him, he didn't retreat. He drifted. He moved in small, rhythmic steps, always staying just outside the radius of her reach. Every time she tried to cut him off, he was already gone, circling out, his feet finding the perfect angle. It was like trying to catch a shadow with your bare hands. Frustration started to bubble up in her chest. She threw a low kick, and he checked it, his shin hitting hers with a bone-jarring impact that made her leg tremble. She fired a jab, and he slipped it by a fraction of an inch, the wind of his movement ghosting past her ear. He wasn't just defending, he was constantly resetting her rhythm, forcing her to reset her own. 2 minutes into the round, Saskia hit her limit. She decided she was done playing the tactical game. She roared, a primal sound that echoed off the warehouse walls, and lunged forward, abandoning all defense. She wanted to clinch. She wanted to get her hands on his shoulders, to use her mass to drive him into the canvas, to break his rhythm by literally crushing it under her weight. She got close. For a second, her hands found him. She grabbed his shoulders, pulling him in, and for the first time, she felt that she had the leverage. She had him. But in that exact second, the floor seemed to vanish from underneath her. Bruce didn't panic. He didn't try to pull away. He went with the pull, stepping inside her guard as if he were being sucked in. Before she could transition into a knee or a takedown, he had already changed the angle. He delivered a knee to her thigh, sharp, stinging, deadening the muscle. And then, with a movement that was too fast for the eye to track, he drove an elbow into her shoulder. It wasn't a knockout blow, but it was a reset button. Her arm went dead for a second. She lost her grip. She stumbled backward, her breath ragged. The crowd was silent now. They were watching something that defied their understanding of combat. The woman who had built her entire reputation on overwhelming her opponents with size was being outmuscled by a man who looked like he could be broken in half. Saskia was gasping. Her ribs, bruised from the first round, were screaming every time she inhaled. Her legs were heavy, sluggish. The adrenaline that usually carried her through a fight was turning into a thick, suffocating dread. She looked at Bruce, and she saw the same calm, unbothered expression he'd worn since the first minute.
"You said, real men have mass," Bruce began, his voice calm, steady, and completely free of judgment. "And you weren't wrong. Mass is powerful. Size matters. Everything you have built, all that heavy iron you've pushed, all that strength you've developed over years of relentless sacrifice, it is completely legitimate. Never think for a second that I am dismissing the value of physical power." Kurt nodded slowly, his massive shoulders slumping slightly. The fierce, defensive armor of his ego was completely gone. "But," Bruce continued, leaning forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, "you made mass your only tool. And when you make any single attribute your exclusive weapon, you inevitably become predictable. And in any physical exchange, predictable means vulnerable." Kurt frowned, staring down at his thick, calloused hands against the sand. "I've won every strength competition I've ever entered," he said softly, not with defiance but out of genuine, honest confusion. "I've beaten men my size and men even bigger than me. How is that predictable?" "Because," Bruce explained patiently, "they were all playing your game, mass against mass, strength against strength. It is like two heavy freight trains colliding head-on. Naturally, the heavier train wins the wreckage. But what happens when you step into an arena with someone who refuses to play that game? Someone who isn't trying to match your raw strength, but is actively working to completely circumvent it." Kurt instinctively reached up, pressing his palm back against his chest where the strike had landed. "That blow. I've sparred with heavyweight boxing champions. I've taken heavy hits from men twice my size. But that felt completely different. It was like you weren't even hitting my body." "Because," Bruce confirmed softly, "I didn't hit your muscles. I hit through them. Your solar plexus is a dense network of nerves that controls your entire respiratory system, tying directly into your vital organs. You spent years building thick layers of exterior muscle armor around your torso to protect against blunt force trauma. Against a standard, looping punch, that armor works wonderfully. But if you truly understand human anatomy, if you know the precise coordinates of vulnerability and how to deliver kinetic energy that penetrates rather than merely impacts, then external muscle mass becomes completely irrelevant." Bruce stood up smoothly, demonstrating the principle on his own body with a light, precise touch to his chest. This point right here lies approximately 3 inches beneath the surface. Most people punch at the surface, letting the impact spread harmlessly across muscle tissue where it gets absorbed and wasted. But if you generate force from your entire structural foundation, linking the ground through your legs, up through your hips, twisting your core, driving through your shoulder straight into your fist, you create explosive, penetrating power over a minimal distance. The force doesn't disperse. It drives like a spear straight to the target. Your nervous system experienced a direct, instantaneous short circuit. That is why you couldn't breathe. Not because I hit with brute force, but because I hit with absolute precision. Kurt listened with an intensity he had never given to any powerlifting manual, coaching seminar, or strongman book in his entire life. The mechanical logic made a terrifying, beautiful kind of sense. So, what you're saying is that technique beats strength? Kurt asked, looking up. Bruce shook his head firmly. No. I am saying that efficiency, properly applied, can completely overcome strength, but only if that technique is stripped of all waste. Most traditional martial arts are too complex, too cluttered, too telegraphed. They require too much setup time, giving an opponent of your size all the time they need to exploit your power. What I used on you was the absolute simplest expression of power. A straight line, zero wasted motion, zero telegraph, arriving at the target before your nervous system could even register the threat. A heavy, reflective silence hung between them for a moment before Kurt looked up, his voice dropping all pretense of pride, leaving behind only the pure desire to learn. Could you teach me that? Bruce studied the giant man for a long, searching moment, evaluating not just his physical capabilities, but the deeper architecture of his character. I can teach you the principles, Bruce replied, his eyes sharp and steady. But first, you have to unlearn everything that brought you here.
You must stop thinking of your mass as your primary weapon, Bruce continued, his voice steady against the rhythmic crash of the Pacific surf. Think of it instead as one tool among many in a comprehensive toolbox. In specific, high-intensity scenarios, facing multiple aggressive attackers, navigating a tight grappling entanglement, or executing heavy labor where absolute physical displacement is required, your 315 pounds is an extraordinary, overwhelming asset. But when you face a single, highly skilled opponent who understands geometry, timing, angles, and precision striking, your sheer mass suddenly transforms into a liability. It becomes dead weight you are forced to carry, momentum you must constantly manage, and a massive physical target protected only by layers of tissue that can be bypassed entirely if the striker knows where and how to look. Kurt sat quietly, letting the profound weight of those words settle deep into his consciousness. Years of intense training, countless hours spent lifting impossible amounts of iron, and a lifetime of building his body into an intimidating fortress of muscle were suddenly being reframed not as a pinnacle of achievement, but as an incomplete chapter. Yet, standing there beside the ocean, looking at the man who had effortlessly dismantled his entire philosophy in the span of 6 heartbeats, he felt no anger. There was only the humbling, liberating realization that true mastery begins precisely where ego ends. "Do you train people?" Kurt asked, looking up with genuine sincerity. "I have a school in Los Angeles," Bruce answered. "I teach core principles, not rigid styles. No classical forms, no traditional constraints, no dogmatic rules, just absolute efficiency, absolute directness. What I call Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist." "Can I come?" Bruce studied the giant man once more, looking past the impressive physical shell to evaluate his willingness to submit to true learning. "I can teach you," Bruce said slowly, "but you must understand one fundamental truth before you ever walk through my doors. Training with me means accepting that everything you currently think you know about fighting is fundamentally incomplete. Can you handle that?" After a long, reflective pause, Kurt managed a quiet, self-aware smile. "Yeah. After today, I think I can definitely handle that." They stood up together and shook hands. This time the grip carried no trace of challenge, no posturing, and no hidden aggression. It was the solemn, grounded handshake between a dedicated teacher and an eager student. Word of what transpired that Saturday afternoon on the sun-drenched sands of Venice Beach did not stay a secret for long. Like wildfire through dry timber, the story raced through the tight-knit circles of California bodybuilding, powerlifting, and athletic clubs. Within days, everyone from local gym rats to heavyweight competitors had heard some version of the legend. A 135-pound martial artist had dropped a massive 315-pound strongman in 6 seconds flat using a single, devastating strike. As expected, the reactions fractured sharply along predictable lines. Skeptics dismissed it outright as an exaggerated myth, an impossible campfire story born from hyperactive imaginations or a lucky fluke. Others chuckled, refusing to believe that brute size could ever be compromised by mere technique. But the 50 witnesses who had actually stood on that wooden platform,
The bodybuilders, trainers, and casual onlookers who watched the physics of dominance turn upside down did not debate. They didn't need to argue. They knew exactly what their eyes had witnessed. They had seen raw power meet absolute understanding, and they knew the world of physical training had fundamentally changed. True to his word, Kurt Wagner showed up at Bruce's Los Angeles school the following week. When the massive strongman walked through the front doors, the existing students, most of whom weighed 150 pounds or less, froze in stunned silence. But Bruce welcomed him with characteristic warmth, introducing him simply as Kurt, a new student who started at the very bottom like everyone else. In that school, size did not dictate rank and muscle did not buy respect. The transition was agonizingly difficult at first. Kurt's nervous system and musculature had spent years being conditioned to generate power through heavy, linear, predictable patterns. Unlearning those deeply ingrained physical habits proved infinitely harder than learning them from scratch. He was constantly fighting his own size, struggling to stop relying on his mass, and instead learn how to move like water, fluid, adaptable, and blindingly efficient. But he persevered, grinding through the frustration week after week, month after month.
Slowly, a remarkable transformation took place. Kurt did not lose his incredible strength. He maintained his powerlifting routine and continued competing in regional strongman events. But he added something vital to his physical arsenal: precision, timing, and structural intelligence. He learned how to read his opponent's micro-movements, how to intercept attacks before they fully materialized, and how to deliver force with surgical accuracy rather than bludgeoning volume. A year after that fateful day at Venice Beach, Kurt returned to competitive strength sports. But something profound had changed in his approach. He no longer won solely through raw intimidation or heavy-handed brute force. He won through the intelligent, refined application of strength. He positioned himself more efficiently, wasted zero energy, and moved with a fluid awareness that baffled his peers. Other competitors noticed the subtle, undeniable evolution in his game. Some assumed he had discovered a revolutionary new training program, secret supplements, or exotic conditioning techniques. When Kurt casually told them he had been studying under Bruce Lee, many laughed it off. The idea of a martial artist teaching a heavyweight strongman seemed entirely backward to the uninitiated. But the athletes who were truly serious about breaking through their own plateaus asked for details, wanting to know the secret behind his transformation. Slowly, quietly, Bruce's philosophy began to infiltrate the strength community, reshaping how athletes thought about power, movement, and capability in ways that had nothing to do with Hollywood movies or public fame. It was about pure, undeniable results, the kind forged by anyone humble enough to admit that strength without wisdom is merely noise. Years later, long after Bruce Lee's untimely passing had left a permanent void in the martial arts world, Kurt Wagner was interviewed for a landmark historical documentary exploring the evolution of combat sports in America. The interviewer inevitably brought up the legendary, whispered about encounter on the beaches of Venice in 1971, asking if the story had grown distorted and exaggerated over decades of retelling. Kurt sat back, looked thoughtfully into the camera lens, and smiled faintly before answering. "I can only tell you precisely what my body experienced," Kurt said, his voice steady and deeply reflective. "I weighed 315 pounds of dense muscle. I could lift more iron than anyone I knew. I genuinely believed that mass equaled power, and power equaled absolute dominance." He paused, shaking his head slightly at the memory. "And then Bruce Lee touched me, and I emphasized touched, because it wasn't even a fully extended punch, and my entire physical system simply stopped working. Every single thing I thought I understood about strength became completely irrelevant in the span of 6 seconds." The interviewer leaned forward, pressing the point. "Do you still believe size matters in a real, high-stakes physical confrontation?" Kurt's answer came without a moment of hesitation. "Size matters, strength matters, but understanding matters infinitely more. If you are ever unfortunate enough to face someone who truly understands combat at a fundamental level, someone who has mastered human anatomy, physics, and kinetic linkage the way Bruce did, then your size will actually work against you. You are carrying heavy weight that slows your transitions, managing massive momentum that makes your movements predictable, and relying on muscle armor
that can be easily penetrated if you don't know where the strike is coming from. "Do you still train?" the interviewer asked. "Every single day," Kurt replied, a quiet pride in his eyes. "I still lift weights. I still compete in strength events. But I also train in Jeet Kune Do. I study efficiency. I learned how to truly read people." Bruce gave me an incredible gift that day at Venice Beach. He gave me humility. And humility is the only foundation strong enough to build true, lasting mastery upon. That afternoon on the sun-baked sands of California became more than just a fleeting moment between two extraordinary men. It cemented itself as an immortal legend in the history of physical culture. Different versions would always circulate, some claiming Bruce knocked Kurt unconscious, others swearing nothing out of the ordinary happened at all. But the 50 witnesses who stood on that platform, and the strongman who lived the lesson firsthand, knew the undeniable truth. They had watched mass meet precision. They had seen raw power bow before absolute understanding, and they had witnessed the exact moment when the world of strength learned a timeless, indelible truth. Real power is never just about how much weight you can carry, but how deeply you understand the mechanics of the human experience.